Jared Sterling found himself gazing at his own reflection mirrored in the polished surface of the Astro 7's engine room console. At the age of 26, he held the distinction of being the youngest engineer ever assigned to an interstellar research vessel, and certainly the most anxious one. He nervously adjusted his standard-issue blue jumpsuit, attempting to project an air of professionalism that belied the butterflies in his stomach. Engineering status report, the ship's AI announced in its monotonous, metallic tone. All systems are nominal. Current internal temperature, 20 degrees Celsius. Thanks, but I can read the displays myself, Jared muttered under his breath, as he swiped through the diagnostic screens. The fusion core's output appeared flawless, yet he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was overlooking something crucial. After 3 weeks into his assignment, he still felt like an outsider among the crew, especially when certain crew members were present. The gentle whoosh of the automatic door caused him to stand up straighter as two identical figures gracefully entered the engine room, their movements perfectly synchronized with an otherworldly elegance. These were Xyla and Aria, the senior Krillian twins. While they initially appeared human, there was an ethereal quality about them that hinted at their alien heritage. Their flawless features and refined presence suggested that they had stepped right out of a classical painting. Engineer Sterling, Xyla began, her voice possessing a distinct melodic quality that never failed to make his heart skip a beat. We require your assistance with the thermal regulation systems in the research lab. Jared struggled to maintain his professional demeanor, as their presence always seemed to fill the room. What seems to be the problem? He asked calmly. The temperature has increased by 0.3 degrees, Aria stated, leaning slightly closer than necessary to show him her data pad. Her long, silken hair brushed against his arm, sending an unexpected tingle through him. This is unacceptable for our sensitive equipment. 3 degrees, Jared corrected, blinking, trying to focus on the technical issue rather than how distracting her proximity was. That's well within normal variance, perhaps acceptable on your planet, Xyla interjected, moving to his other side, effectively trapping him between them. Such imprecision is acceptable, but Krillo's technology requires exact temperature control. The twins exchanged a look over his head, causing him to wonder if they were aware of the effect they had on him. I'll take a look, he said, grabbing his toolkit. Though I should warn you, my primitive human hands might struggle with your advanced technology. A hint of a smile played across Xyla's perfect lips. We have faith in your capabilities, Engineer Sterling. Their walk to the research lab was suddenly interrupted by playful laughter echoing down the corridor. The younger twins, Naira and Sykes, rounded the corner with an energy that seemed to illuminate the sterile corridor. Their standard flight suits somehow looked more like evening wear on their flawless frames. Jared, Naira practically purred his name. We were just discussing human courtship customs. Is it true that Xyla's sharp tone could have frozen hydrogen? This is hardly appropriate conversation. Sykes's laughter was like silver bells. We're just conducting cultural research, sister. Isn't that what we're here for? She gave Jared a wink that made his collar feel suddenly tight. The only research you should be conducting, Aria said, though Jared noticed her eyes lingering on him a little longer than was necessary, is on our navigation trajectories, the stellar mapping. A violent shudder ran through the ship, cutting her off mid-sentence. Jared's engineering instincts kicked in even before the alarm sounded. Without thinking, he reached out to steady Xyla as she stumbled, finding himself holding her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Warning, the AI announced. Unusual radiation signature detected. Shield modifications recommended. They rushed to the bridge, professional duties momentarily overriding the simmering tension between them. The ship's view screen showed a strange distortion in the star field ahead, a pattern he had never encountered before. Analysis, he called out, sliding into the engineering station, acutely aware of how Naira and Sykes kept finding excuses to brush past him as they moved to their stations. Unknown energy pattern, Naira reported, her voice serious for once. It's not in any of our databases. Radiation levels increasing, Sykes added, though she still managed to shoot him a flirtatious glance. Shield harmonics are fluctuating. Another tremor rocked the ship. Jared's displays lit up with warning indicators as systems began to fail in a cascading fashion. The temperature control system flashed red, he announced frantically. Thermal regulators are offline. I'm trying to reroute power. We're losing environmental control. Impossible, Zyla said, leaning over his shoulder, so close he could feel her breath on his neck. Our systems are designed with redundancies. Well, they're failing anyway. Jared snapped, trying to ignore how her proximity was affecting his concentration. Unless you've got a better solution. The ship lurched again, even harder this time. Warning klaxons blared as more systems went dark. Jared noticed beads of sweat forming on the twins' faces as the temperature began to rise. Despite their human appearance, he knew their Krillian physiology made them exceptionally sensitive to heat. Temperature now 23 degrees Celsius and rising, the AI reported calmly. Zyla, Arya, I need your research data on radiation patterns. Naira, Sykes, plot us a course out of here. Maximum safe speed. The authority in his voice surprised even himself, and he couldn't help but notice how quickly they responded, their usual cool demeanor cracking under the pressure. Finding our limits already, Engineer Sterling? Arya asked, her voice carrying a hint of something that was definitely not professional curiosity. You haven't seen my limits yet, Jared muttered, then immediately regretted his choice of words as he caught the interested looks from all four women. As the temperature continued to climb and systems failed around them, Jared realized this crisis was about to test more than just his engineering skills. The way the Krillian women kept looking at him, with a mixture of professional respect and something far more personal, suggested that maintaining professional boundaries might prove even more challenging than fixing the ship's systems. And judging by the way the temperature kept rising, things were about to get a lot more interesting on the Astro 7. Part 2. Temperature now 30 degrees Celsius and rising, the RA's calm voice contrasted sharply with the mounting tension on the bridge. Jared wiped sweat from his forehead as he worked furiously at the engineering console. The Krillian women were showing increasing signs of distress, their usual composed demeanor cracking under the relentless heat. This is most uncomfortable, Zyla said, trying to maintain her scientific detachment even as she tugged at the collar of her uniform. Human bodies appear better adapted to these conditions. Our environmental suits were designed for cold resistance, not heat dissipation. Arya added, her voice strained. She had moved closer to Jared's station, perhaps unconsciously drawn to the relative cool around him. We need to reduce our thermal signature, Jared said, his fingers flying over the controls. Standard uniforms are engineered to retain heat, they're working against us now. Naira, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly perked up. Are you suggesting we remove our uniforms, Engineer Sterling? The playful tone was back in her voice, despite her obvious discomfort. Jared felt his face flush, and not just from the heat. I'm suggesting we modify them. The emergency protocols actually. Zyla interrupted, her scientific curiosity seemingly overwhelming her cultural reservations. That's not an entirely inappropriate suggestion. Human thermal regulation through perspiration is quite efficient. Our own biology. She trailed off, looking uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Sister, are you actually advocating we undress? Arya asked, though Jared noticed she was already unfastening the top buttons of her uniform. I'm evaluating survival, Zyla replied primly, though her eyes kept darting to Jared's exposed forearms where he'd rolled up his sleeves. Engineer Sterling, please explain human thermoregulation in detail. From her navigation station, Sykes suddenly let out a small gasp. The heat, it's becoming unbearable. She swayed dramatically in her chair. Sykes! Jared was at her side in an instant, supporting her. Her skin felt far too warm to the touch. Are you all right? Better now, she murmured, leaning into him with what he strongly suspected was unnecessary enthusiasm. You're so cool, fascinating. Fascinating, Zyla observed, moving closer to study them. The temperature differential between human and Krillian body temperature in these conditions. She reached out to place a hand on Jared's arm, ostensibly for research purposes. The cooling effect is quite noticeable. Purely scientific, of course. Purely scientific? Arya asked her twin with a raised eyebrow, though she too had drifted closer to Jared. Of course, Zyla replied, not removing her hand. Engineer Sterling, would you object to serving as a control subject for temperature comparison studies? Before Jared could respond, Naira had abandoned her station to join them. I believe proper scientific method requires multiple data points, she said innocently. We should all verify these findings. The heat is affecting your judgment, Jared said, trying to maintain some professional distance despite how the four beautiful women were gradually surrounding him. We need to focus on the ship systems. The ship systems are automated for the moment, Naira countered, and this is clearly a matter of crew safety. Isn't that your responsibility, engineer? The temperature continued to climb, and Jared watched as the twins, one by one, began shedding their outer uniform layers, revealing the form-fitting thermal undergarments beneath. He tried to keep his eyes on his console, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Temperature 35 degrees Celsius, the AI announced, as if to underscore the gravity of their situation. Jared, Zyla said, using his first name for the first time, her scientific facade cracking, your thermal regulation abilities might be our best chance at preventing heat stroke until we can repair the systems. Would you? That is from a purely medical standpoint. What my sister is failing to ask, Naira cut in, is whether you be willing to share your naturally cooling presence with us, for survival purposes of course. Jared looked at the four women, now all showing clear signs of heat distress. Despite their attempts to maintain dignity, their cultural taboos about physical contact were warring visibly with their need for relief from the heat. I suppose, he said carefully, if it's for survival purposes, purely scientific, Zyla agreed quickly, though her hand hadn't left his arm. Absolutely professional, Arya added, moving to his other side. Emergency procedures, Naira said, finding a reason to adjust his collar. Basic survival, Sykes concluded, still leaning against him. As Jared found himself becoming the center of a very professional, very scientific, and very close group of stunning alien women, he couldn't help thinking that his engineering training hadn't quite prepared him for this kind of crisis management. The temperature kept rising, and with it, the tension between maintaining proper protocol and preventing his crew from succumbing to the heat. And judging by the way the twins were looking at him, their usual cool reserve melting away with each degree increase, this was going to be a very long and interesting shift. Perhaps, Zyla said, her scientific tone belied by how she pressed closer to Jared's cooler body, we should relocate to the engineering bay for more precise temperature monitoring. Excellent suggestion, Arya agreed quickly. The diagnostic equipment there is more sophisticated. Jared tried to focus on walking normally with four Krillian women clustered around him like elegant satellites. Their a-touch taboo culture seemed to be rapidly evolving in the face of necessity, and possibly, other motivations. The engineering bay's relative isolation and abundance of monitoring equipment made it the logical choice, but Jared suspected the twins had other reasons for suggesting it. As the doors slid shut behind them, he noticed how they positioned themselves strategically around him. Temperature 37 degrees Celsius, the AI announced helpfully. This is becoming dangerous for Krillian physiology, Zyla observed, running a hand through her long hair in an uncharacteristically flustered gesture. Jared, would you mind if I conducted a direct comparative analysis? Before he could answer, she'd pressed herself against his side, sighing in relief at the temperature difference. Fascinating. The cooling effect is most pronounced with direct, she caught herself, a blush coloring her cheeks, direct proximity. As a scientist, I should verify these findings, Arya said, claiming his other side. For accuracy. Naira pouted from where she stood. Navigation officers require optimal temperature regulation too. Our calculations could be affected by heat stress. Indeed, Sykes agreed, moving closer. It would be terrible if we miscalculated our position due to thermal disruption. Jared found himself becoming a literal hotspot for increasingly uninhibited Krillian women. Their usual reserve was melting away with the heat, revealing personalities that had been hidden beneath their professional facades. "Tell me, Jared," Naira said, trailing a finger down his arm, "do all humans have such efficient thermal regulation, or are you a particularly good specimen?" Sykes added with a grin. Jared struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. "It varies by individual, but we should focus on the ship's systems." "Oh, but this is crucial research," Zyla interrupted, her scientific vocabulary barely masking her interest. "The interaction between human and Krillian biology could have significant implications for future cooperation between our species." Arya nodded seriously, though her hand had somehow found its way to his chest. "We should document everything thoroughly for posterity." "Speaking of documentation," Naira said innocently, "human courtship rituals often involve close physical proximity, don't they? Perhaps we could combine our research objectives." "That's hardly appropriate," Jared began, but was interrupted by another ship-wide shudder. The sudden movement sent them all stumbling. Jared instinctively reached out to steady the nearest twin, Zyla, and found himself holding her rather closer than protocol would normally allow. Her eyes widened at the contact, but she made no move to pull away. "Quick reactions," she murmured. "Another admirable human trait." "Very admirable," Arya agreed, watching them with undisguised interest. "You know," Sykes said thoughtfully, "on Krillos, such quick thinking would merit a traditional gesture of gratitude." "We're not on Krillos," Zyla said quickly, though she still hadn't moved from Jared's arms, "and I'm sure Engineer Sterling isn't interested in our cultural practices." "Actually," Jared found himself saying, "cultural exchange is part of our mission, isn't it?" For pairs of eyes fixed on him with sudden intensity. "Well," Naira practically purred, "in that case, we have so much to teach each other." The temperature continued to rise, but somehow Jared suspected that wasn't the only reason his uniform felt increasingly uncomfortable. As he looked at the four beautiful women surrounding him, their usual cool reserve replaced by something far more intriguing, he realized the real challenge wouldn't be fixing the ship systems. It would be surviving the increasingly heated attention of Krillian women, who seemed to have decided that cultural exchange was their new primary mission objective. "Temperature 39 degrees Celsius, the AI announced, seemingly oblivious to the rising tension in engineering. "This cultural exchange idea," Naira said, moving closer to Jared while ostensibly checking a diagnostic panel, "fascinates me. For instance, how do humans typically show appreciation?" Jared tried to focus on the environmental controls, but it was increasingly difficult with Naira practically draped over his shoulder. "Well, usually, on Krillos," Sykes interrupted, sliding gracefully to his other side, "we have many traditional ways of expressing gratitude. Would you like a demonstration?" "That's not exactly standard protocol," Zyla interjected, though Jared noticed she was watching the interaction with poorly concealed interest. "Protocol seems rather flexible at the moment," Arya observed, gesturing to their current state of undress. The twins had shed their outer uniforms down to their regulation undergarments, which somehow managed to look both professional and distractingly appealing. Jared wiped more sweat from his brow, trying to maintain his composure. The priority should be stabilizing the ship's systems. "Of course," Zyla agreed quickly, moving to help him with the controls. Her long hair brushed against his arm as she leaned in. "Though I must say, your cooling presence is quite remarkable. Purely from a scientific standpoint," Arya added, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Speaking of science," Naira said with a mischievous glint in her eye, "I've been researching human physiological responses to various stimuli." For instance, she deliberately pressed closer, and Jared's physiological response was immediate and embarrassingly obvious. The twins exchanged knowing looks. "Fascinating reaction," Zyla murmured, her scientific detachment slipping. "Perhaps we should conduct more thorough observations, for research purposes," Arya agreed, moving to block the engineering bay entrance with a surprisingly soft motion. "The ship systems." Jared started to protest but was cut off by another violent shudder. This time Sykes practically fell into his arms. "Oh my," she breathed, making no attempt to move away. "How fortunate you have such quick reflexes." "Very fortunate," Naira agreed, her eyes sparkling. "Though I think I might need catching too." "This is highly irregular," Zyla said, though she was watching Jared's hands on her sister with obvious interest. "Though I suppose in emergency situations certain protocols can be adjusted." "Exactly," Arya said, "studying human thermal regulation could be crucial for future missions. We should be very thorough." Jared found himself surrounded by four increasingly bold Krillian women. Their usual reserve completely abandoned in the rising heat. Their cultural taboos seemed to be melting away with each degree increase in temperature. "I've always wondered," Naira said, trailing a finger down his chest, "about human endurance levels. Your ability to maintain functionality in these conditions is impressive." "Very impressive," Sykes agreed, pressing closer to his other side. "Perhaps you could demonstrate other human capabilities for scientific documentation?" Zyla added quickly, though her breathing had become noticeably uneven. "Purely professional interest," Arya said, moving to join the increasingly intimate group. Jared looked at the four stunning women surrounding him, their professional facades completely dropped, replaced by something far more primal and interesting. The ship's crisis seemed to have broken down all their cultural barriers, leaving raw attraction in its wake. "Well," he said, surprising himself with his boldness, in the interest of interspecies cooperation, for pairs of eyes lit up with immediate interest. "Do continue," Zyla breathed, her scientific objectivity completely forgotten. "Temperature 40 degrees Celsius, the AI announced, as the engineering bay felt increasingly like a sauna. Jared found himself in an increasingly complex situation. The Fokrillian women's professional demeanor continued to melt away. The heat had pushed them well beyond their usual cultural boundaries, and their growing attraction was becoming harder to ignore. "You know," Naira said, her voice dropping to a sultry whisper, "on Krillos, when someone saves your life, they become bound to you through an ancient tradition." "Life-saving might be an exaggeration," Jared managed, though his voice wasn't quite steady as she pressed closer. "Our body temperatures are reaching dangerous levels," Zyla interjected, her scientific tone betrayed by the way she was looking at him. "Without your cooling presence, we could be in serious trouble." "Sounds like life-saving to me," Sykes agreed, gracefully sliding closer. "And traditions must be honored." The ship lurched again, sending them all stumbling. This time, Jared found himself catching both Zyla and Arya, their bodies pressed against him in a way that made it very difficult to think professionally. "Your quick reflexes are remarkable," Arya murmured, making no move to step away. "Perhaps you could teach us more about human capabilities, for scientific purposes?" Zyla added quickly, though her hands had somehow found their way to his shoulders. "Of course," Jared said, his own resistance weakening in the face of their obvious interest. "Cultural exchange is important." Naira's eye sparkled with triumph. "Then you wouldn't object to learning some Krillian customs, starting with our traditional greeting for honored allies?" Before Jared could respond, she had moved forward with fluid grace, her face inches from his. The other twins watched with intense interest, moving closer as if drawn by magnetic force. "I believe," Sykes said softly, "this requires participation from all involved parties." The temperature continued to rise, but Jared barely noticed. The four stunning women had completely abandoned their usual reserve, their attraction obvious in every movement, every look, every touch. The ship's crisis had broken down all barriers between them, leading to something unexpected, but increasingly difficult to resist. Hours later, the ship's temperature remained critically high, but the atmosphere in engineering had changed dramatically. The previous rigid professional boundaries between Jared and the Krillian twins had transformed into something far more intimate. "Your human adaptation to heat is remarkable," Zyla said softly, her usual scientific detachment replaced by genuine admiration, as she rested against his shoulder. "Though I admit my interest has become somewhat less than purely academic." "Less than academic," Arya smiled, uncharacteristically relaxed as she traced patterns on Jared's arm. "Sister, I believe we've thoroughly abandoned scientific objectivity." Naira laughed from where she sat, close to Jared's other side. "Some experiments require a more personal approach." "Speaking of personal approaches," Sykes added with a mischievous glint, "I believe we still have many Krillian customs to teach you." The way she said his name, they all said his name now, had changed completely. Gone was the formal's engineer Sterling, replaced by something far more intimate. The temperature is still rising, Jared noted, trying to maintain some focus on their actual crisis. We need to stay very close, Naira interrupted, pressing nearer. For survival purposes, of course. Of course, Jared agreed, no longer bothering to hide his smile, though I'm starting to suspect your motivations aren't entirely survival-based. The twins exchanged knowing looks. Their previous cool reserve had melted away entirely, replaced by an open affection that made the ship's heat seem mild in comparison. Perhaps, Zyla admitted, her fingers intertwining with his, we've discovered that humans have unexpected qualities worth exploring. Very worth exploring, Arya agreed, her eyes meeting Jared's with newfound warmth. The ship's crisis continued, but something far more interesting had developed in that heated engineering bay. Something that would change their mission and their lives in ways none of them had expected. Temperature reaching critical levels, 42 degrees Celsius, the Arya's announcement cut through the intimate atmosphere that had developed in engineering. Jared reluctantly pulled himself from the comfortable circle of Krillian women. Despite their newfound closeness, the ship's crisis demanded attention. We need a solution fast, he said, his mind racing. Your core temperatures are approaching dangerous levels, Zyla pressed against him, ostensibly checking the engineering displays. Your human thermal regulation system, she mused, her scientific mind engaging despite their intimate situation, could we potentially adapt it somehow? Arya finished her twin's thought, moving to Jared's other side. Create an emergency cooling system based on human physiology. Jared's eyes widened as the idea took shape. The environmental systems, he began, excitement building, we could modify them to mimic human perspiration on a ship-wide scale. That would require significant modifications, Zyla said, her hands flying over the console, and a direct interface with human biological readings. My readings, Jared said, understanding what that meant. He would need to connect himself directly to the ship's systems, making himself physically and emotionally vulnerable. Naira touched his arm gently. That could be dangerous for you. Very dangerous, Sykes agreed, concern evident in her voice. The energy requirements alone, but possible, Jared insisted, already starting to remove monitoring equipment from the walls. Zyla, Arya, I need your expertise with the technical modifications. Naira, Sykes, monitor ship systems and my vital signs. The twins moved with newfound purpose, their previous flirtation transformed into focus and determination, though their touches lingered longer than strictly necessary as they worked. Connecting environmental controls to human biosensors, Zyla reported, her fingers dancing across the console. Jared will need to, that is, you'll have to remove most of my clothing for proper sensor contact, he finished, already starting to strip down. The twins' reactions to his increasing exposure might have been amusing under other circumstances. For purely scientific purposes, Arya murmured, though her eyes told a different story. Of course, Naira agreed with a smirk, helping attach sensors to Jared's chest. Though I must say, human anatomy is fascinating. Focus, Jared reminded them, though he couldn't help smiling. Ship first, cultural exchange later. The modification process was intimate by necessity, requiring all four women to help connect Jared to the ship systems. Their touch was professional but tender, revealing how much their relationships had evolved since the crisis began. Ready for interface, Zyla announced, her hand lingering on Jared's shoulder. This will be intense. We'll monitor you closely, Sykes promised, squeezing his hand. Jared nodded, bracing himself. Do it. The connection surged through him like liquid fire. His body's cooling system kicked into overdrive, as the ship's environmental controls synced with his physiology. He gasped at the sensation, and immediately felt for pairs of hands steadying him. Remarkable, Zyla breathed, watching the readings. The ship is actually adopting human thermal regulation patterns. Temperature dropping, Naira reported excitedly. 41, Jared barely heard them, lost in the strange sensation of being connected to the ship itself. He felt every degree change, every system adjustment, as if they were happening within his own body. "Jared?" Arya's worried voice cut through his daze. "Are you all right?" He managed to nod, leaning heavily against her. "Just intense. Temperature stabilizing at 25 degrees Celsius, the AI announced, sounding almost impressed. The relief in the room was palpable. The four women surrounded Jared, supporting him as Xyla carefully disconnected the sensors. Their touch had changed again, no longer merely flirtatious or professional, but deeply personal. "That was," Xyla started. "Incredible," Arya finished. "We may have been hasty in our assessment of human capabilities," Sykes admitted, helping Jared to sit. "Very hasty," Naira agreed, running her fingers through his hair. "I believe we owe you several traditional gestures of gratitude." "Speaking of traditions," Xyla said, unusually hesitant, "there's an ancient Krillian custom for situations like this. When someone proves themselves exceptionally worthy," Arya continued, exchanging meaningful looks with her sisters. "They are offered a permanent position as a cultural liaison," Naira added, her smile promising much more than official duties, with very personal responsibilities. Sykes finished, her meaning clear. Jared looked at the four beautiful women surrounding him, their previous cool reserve replaced by open affection and invitation. "A cultural liaison position?" he asked, playing along. "That sounds interesting." "Very interesting," Xyla agreed, moving closer. "We have so much to learn about each other and teach each other." Arya added softly, "though some lessons," Naira said with a suggestive smile, "might require private instruction." "Very private," Sykes agreed. As Jared looked at his stunning crewmates, now so different from the cool, distant women he'd first met, he knew the ship's crisis had changed everything between them. Their previous cultural barriers had melted away, replaced by something far more interesting and much warmer. "Well," he said, pulling them closer, in the interest of interstellar relations, their laughter filled the engineering bay, now comfortably cool, but promising plenty of heat in their future together.